Hello and welcome to 15 Minutes in Canberra. I'm Hayley, Senior Policy Fellow with the Perth US Asia Centre. We are extremely fortunate today to be joined by Hunter Marston. Hunter is a PhD candidate at the Australian National University, and his area of expertise is great power competition in Southeast Asia. In particular, Hunter explores how states in Southeast Asia, including Singapore, Vietnam and Myanmar, form hedging strategies to manage their relations with the United States and China. Prior to joining ANU, Hunter worked as a senior research assistant at the Brookings Institution in Washington, DC. He's also recently completed field research on social media and violence in Myanmar as a Robert Myers Fellow. While completing a Master of Arts in Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Washington, he spent a summer internship working at the US Embassy in Myanmar. So Hunter brings considerable expertise on Southeast Asia and US-China strategic dynamics. Hunter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
Hunter, I have so many questions about your background. You've been engaged on your PhD for 2 years and you've paid particular attention to Myanmar, Singapore and Vietnam, but you also have experience living and working in Washington, DC and examining great power politics between the US and China. How did you get into this research area to begin with?
I studied abroad in India in 2005. I was a religious studies major in undergraduate. I was studying Buddhist philosophy and history. I ended up studying in a Burmese monastery, which I suppose planted the seed for my interest in Burma and Myanmar, if that's something I didn't really realize overtly at the time, given the fact that I was in India. And following my undergraduate studies, I chose to travel to Vietnam to teach English. Mostly because it was a country I didn't know anything about, and I hadn't grown up traveling internationally, so I really wanted to see the world, and Vietnam was about as far away and unknown as I could go. But while I was in Vietnam for a couple of years, I was traveling around mainland Southeast Asia, primarily in Cambodia and Laos and Thailand, neighboring countries that have a shared history with Vietnam. And I was reading a lot about history and learning about the interconnected histories of these countries with the United States and China, and the US-Vietnam War. So this really cemented my interest in Southeast Asia. But at the same time, in 2007, I was watching the protests taking place in the streets of Yangon with Buddhist monks standing up against a brutal military dictatorship in Myanmar. And this sort of reconnected me to my Buddhist studies major in undergraduate and made me realize that for the first time, I saw a connection between this sort of ancient history and philosophy that I'd studied and contemporary politics and civil resistance and social movements. But moving towards great power competition, I suppose I always had sort of an interest in these countries and their histories and cultures and societies. But having applied my sort of country and area expertise during my master's and a couple internship experiences, this translated to my time in Washington think tanks. And in Washington, of course, there's a great interest in China and great power competition. So I sort of widened the scope of my analysis to look more broadly at how these countries in Southeast Asia fit into US-China competition. Both great powers are competing, vying for influence in the region. And so I like to think that I'm able to maintain a deep sort of country focus and expertise in some of these individual countries, while also keeping a macro lens focused on US-China competition and the implications for both great powers. Of course, with Southeast Asia, it's a region of 11 countries, 10 members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So it's really impossible to be an expert on all 10 countries or 11 countries. And therefore, you have to sort of choose to prioritize certain countries' languages and expertise there.
Gosh, there's so much to unpack from your answer. I mean, one of the things that stuck out to me, other than the situation in Myanmar, which I want to talk about more later, is just your mention of traveling around Southeast Asia. And I'm wondering if it's as easy now to travel around Southeast Asia as a solo traveler as it ever has been.
I imagine COVID aside, I imagine it's still fairly easy to be a backpacker or English teacher. I think that the English language is still in high demand in most of developing Southeast Asia. And I think as far as I know, visa requirements haven't changed too much. Actually, during the time I was in Vietnam, it was pretty flexible. I was on a tourist visa and working for more than a year, and just continually extended my visas, renewed my visas. So I don't know if that's possible anymore. I've heard it's grown a little stricter. But as far as the sort of backpacking circuit goes, I'm pretty sure it's still a well-trodden path.
Hmm. Yes, I hope people can get back to traveling like that again soon, but who knows when, which is why it's so valuable having someone who's had your experience share it with people. I think too often talking about Southeast Asia and other regions generally, people can get very generalized in how they talk about countries. So even if the region is full of completely different countries with different views and political systems and histories, they often get clumped together and their differences are glossed over. So in terms of your work and travel in Southeast Asia, was there something that struck you about the different approaches of particular countries in Southeast Asia and how they view the Indo-Pacific broadly?
Well, Southeast Asia is an incredibly diverse region. If you go to Indonesia, for instance, it's an archipelagic country with thousands of islands and Buddhist and Muslim and Hindu histories and cultures all interwoven. Vietnam, further to the north, shares a lot of history and culture and legacy with China, its northern neighbor, who it's always sought to juxtapose itself against. So you see a bit more of the sort of Confucian and Buddhist influence of the neighbors to the north in that part of Southeast Asia. And further west, Myanmar is really at the crossroads of South and Southeast Asia. It has a great deal more of historical convergence with India and British imperialism. And that's something you'll even see in the city, the old buildings, the colonial architecture, the design of roads, the curbs. Some roundabouts look similar to New Delhi or Calcutta from British India and the infrastructure that they laid so long ago. But as far as outlooks on the Indo-Pacific go, I think Southeast Asia's diversity is equally matched there. Vietnam, for instance, is really at the forefront of this wariness of China's expansion in the region and pushing back against China's actions in the South China Sea, or the East Sea, as the Vietnamese call it. Whereas a country like Thailand doesn't really see China as a threat, and paradoxically, it has an alliance with the United States, but is much less sort of forward-leaning in its opposition to China. And then countries like Myanmar, obviously a complicated case we can get into a little bit later following our discussion of the coup, but is now much more inward-looking, to sort of put it simply. So there are a range of outlooks on the Indo-Pacific and whether these countries benefit most from maintaining existing ties to China and benefits from its economic engagement, or they want to sort of lean more proactively towards the United States and Japan and other powers to balance against China.
Something that you mentioned before about Myanmar, I just wanted to unpack a bit further. And in terms of your background, what stuck out to me was that you've recently done field research into social media and violence in Myanmar. And of course, my first thought was field research into social media meant you could have just been scrolling through Facebook for hours on end, which is something that I do, but not for scholarly purposes. I'm guessing that your field research was actually in Myanmar, and I'd be, love to hear more about what kind of insights that you found out about how social media is used in relation to the coup as well.
Sure, it's a great question. I benefited from a grant from the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. I was a Robert Myers Fellow, and my interest in social media was sparked by some research that I had done at the Brookings Institution with a colleague. We had written about social media and its critical role in stirring up ethno-nationalism and hate and violence in Myanmar. For this specific research project, I was interested in looking forward to the 2020 election. This was in 2019 when I was traveling there. And I really wanted to know what role social media would play ahead of the election. Would political parties or the military use social media to stir up familiar themes of xenophobia, Buddhist nationalism, to sort of play the race card and characterize their opponents as soft on what's perceived as a Muslim sort of invasion in Buddhist Myanmar. This is a trope that the military has played successfully repeatedly throughout the country's history to unite Buddhist nationalists. But in particular, so you're right, I could just be looking online, tracking social media indicators. There are all sorts of advanced analytics now, which are, to be honest, over my head. But when I was in Myanmar, I was meeting with civil society leaders and people working on these issues who were tracking in real time the political debates and particularly their interaction with race and religion in the country ahead of the election. I really wanted to get a hold on the sort of tone on the ground, the feel in the country ahead of this election. And I was able to meet a lot of people working on this issue from different sides, both private sector and government, as well as civil society, grassroots organizations. And then also Myanmar government stakeholders, the Union Election Commission, who were managing the elections and trying to sort of keep watch on this issue that they knew was going to be so controversial, but really were underprepared to deal with.
Do you still stay in touch with anyone on the ground in Myanmar and to hear from them directly about what the feeling is today on the ground?
I do. It's a sad story. I have many friends in Myanmar, and particularly in Yangon, who are still working in civil society to the best of their abilities, trying to make do. And the coup has been disastrous for the country and its economy, on top of COVID, which has now just erupted in the country to the point where some estimates say a third of Myanmar people could be infected in the next couple of weeks. It's really just outrageous. And the military junta has done very little to take care of its people or deliver medical supplies and provide relief. Instead, it's focused on cracking down on what it sees as resistance to its rule.
In terms of Australia and the United States and how they have responded to what's happened in Myanmar, I'm just sort of reflecting on the last 12 months or so in Southeast Asia and also Northeast Asia in terms of pro-democracy movements, whether it's in Hong Kong or Myanmar. Countries like Australia and the United States have been, I would say, fairly powerless to do much about it other than making diplomatic representations. Do you think how Australia and to a lesser extent the United States have responded to what's happening in Myanmar has been the right approach, or do you think they should have been doing something else to either influence those countries directly or other multinational organizations?
As an American, I think I have more insight into what the U.S. government has done. I've been paying a bit more attention to that side of the equation. The Biden administration was very quick to denounce the coup and announce economic sanctions, which it increased incrementally and very specifically to go after the military and its economic interests in the country. Australia has not pursued sanctions, though recent legislation will or may allow for the passage of global Magnitsky sanctions to target the military for violations of human rights in the country. Personally, I think it's wise to adopt such sanctions at this point. I don't think that the United States or Australia have enough of an open line of communication with the military and have their ears to actually influence their decision making to such an extent that they should forego economic sanctions. So in this case, I think sanctioning the Myanmar military puts these governments on the right side of the struggle for power in the country. But I do think that they should be doing more to lean on the most influential countries to bring about a solution or put pressure on the Myanmar junta to come to the negotiating table. And particularly that I would point to China, which is the most influential country in Myanmar. The United States and China actually see eye to eye on the Association of Southeast Asian Nations being the best multilateral body to advance diplomacy towards a resolution to the crisis. The fact that Beijing and Washington are in agreement on this is actually a rare convergence in international affairs right now. There was an early fear that Myanmar's chaos might mean proxy wars, or what does this pose? What does this mean for the future of great power competition in Myanmar, and is Myanmar just a pawn? But I don't see it. I don't see the two great powers as diametrically opposed here. In fact, I think that there's a great deal of room for collaboration, cooperation towards a mediated solution.
Well, that's finally a positive indication after so much bad news. So I'm really pleased that that's what you think. That's the end of part 1. Listen to part 2 now to hear Hunter's view on US-China strategic competition and its impacts on both Singapore and Vietnam.